Hi, everybody! In this video, we'll review a 2002 crime movie that follows the story of Frank Abagnale Jr. and his family, who live a comfortable life in New Rochelle, New Jersey. One night, while on their way back from a Rotary Club event, Frank Sr. tells his son about how he met his wife, Paula, and they dance to Ella Fitzgerald's Embraceable. The next morning, Frank Sr. wakes up his son and takes him to a tailor to borrow a black suit for an important meeting at Chase in Manhattan Bank. Despite being rejected by the tailor, Frank Sr. manages to get a suit by using a gold necklace as leverage. Frank Jr. is instructed by his father to stay in the car while he enters the bank. Frank Sr. asks his son why the Yankees always win and teaches him the value of misdirection. However, Frank Sr. is unable to borrow money from the bank due to an ongoing investigation into his tax fraud. The family's financial struggles continue, leading to their relocation from their home and Frank Jr.'s enrollment in a public school. On his first day, Frank Jr. wears his private school uniform and is bullied by a classmate who comments that he looks like a substitute teacher. Despite these challenges, Frank Sr. still tries to do right by his son by giving him a checkbook and opening a bank account with 20 files. One day, Frank Jr. decides to pose as a substitute teacher and successfully fools the class, even humiliating the bully who previously shoved him. The principal eventually calls his parents and reveals that Frank Jr. has been pretending to be a teacher for weeks. Although surprised, Frank Sr. secretly feels proud of his son's cleverness. Later, Frank Jr. is shocked to find his father's friend leaving his mother's bedroom, and she tries to bribe him with money to keep quiet. A lawyer then arrives to speak with Frank Jr.'s parents, who are facing some sort of legal trouble. An official document is given to Frank Jr. to choose which parent he wants to live with. Unable to make a decision, he runs away and spends several months bouncing between hotels and other places using fraudulent checks given to him by his father. He attempts to pass himself off as an older professional to get a loan, but fails at every bank he goes to. After seeing a pilot with beautiful flight attendants, Frank Jr. is inspired to pose as a pilot himself.
Ma'am, I'm sorry to have to tell you, your son is fudging checks.
By interviewing professionals at the airport while pretending to be a high school student writing an article for the school paper. Frank Jr. obtains information to impersonate a pilot by interviewing professionals at the airport and calling Pan Am Air's uniform suppliers to get an official uniform. He even creates fraudulent payroll checks for Pan Am Air employees to cash. One day, he mistakenly boards a plane as a deadhead and learns the meaning of the term. Using his charm and tricks, Frank Jr. is able to accumulate millions through forging checks. He surprises his father with a Cadillac, but Frank Sr. is afraid of the IRS finding it suspicious and becomes emotional. Frank Sr. promises to reunite his family despite his wife's absence, which Frank Jr. desires. FBI agent Carl Henry begins to track down Frank for his check fraud. Carl finds Frank in his hotel room and searches for him at gunpoint. Frank calmly pretends to be Agent Barry Allen from the Secret Service, lowering Carl's guard. He directs Carl to the window and says his partner has already caught the criminal before he can check Frank's identification. When Carl sees Mr. Murphy leaving with his companion, he eases up and Frank slips away with his wallet. Frank continues to pose as a student and learns more about aviation until he is given a news article about a con artist called the Skyway Man. The article inspires Frank to buy the exact suit and car that James Bond wore and spend the night with a seductive woman on Christmas Eve. Meanwhile, Carl is alone in the office while his colleagues are with their families. Carl receives a call from Frank apologizing for deceiving him and asking to meet.
What do you want?
To apologize.
You didn't call to apologize, did you? You have no one else to call.
But Carl dismisses it and upsets Frank by claiming he has no one else to call. Frank hangs up and Carl finds it amusing. The next day, Carl is at a diner when a waiter recognizes his Barry Allen papers and reveals that it's the secret identity of the Flash. Realizing that Frank is just a kid, Carl contacts his colleagues to look for missing child cases and finds Frank's mother.
He's a kid. That's why he doesn't have a record.
Paula helps the FBI agents identify Frank by providing them with his yearbook photo. Frank uses his money to throw parties and meets a nurse named Brenda at the hospital where his friend was admitted. Frank lies about being a doctor and even lands a supervisory position at the hospital.
Mr. Harris.
Yes?
Do you concur?
Concur with what, sir?
He develops a romantic connection with Brenda, but their kiss is interrupted. In a letter to his father, Frank expresses his desire to settle down with someone and hints at his affection for Brenda. When a young boy is brought into the ER after a bike accident, the staff asks Frank for advice, which he fakes his way through. Carl Henry meets with Frank Sr. and sees where Frank Jr. inherited his personality from. Frank Sr. is evasive about his son, but Carl sees Frank Jr.'s letters and notes his address. Frank expresses his love for Brenda and lies about being a lawyer, leading to a job offer from her father. Brenda's father confronts Frank about his true identity. Frank confesses to Brenda's father that he is not a doctor, lawyer, or pilot, but just a kid in love with his daughter. Misinterpreting it as a metaphor, Brenda's father gives his blessing. Frank eventually passes the Louisiana board exam and starts working with Brenda's father. However, he makes a mistake at a judge's house and feels dejected watching Brenda's happy family. Frank meets his father at a bar and learns that his mother has remarried. Frank wants to stop running, but his father encourages him to continue. Frank tells Carl he wants a truce and is getting married soon. Carl tells Frank that he must catch him because it's his job. Frank wishes him a Merry Christmas and hangs up. Carl realizes that Frank won't change his last name after getting married and attends Frank's wedding party. Frank confesses to Brenda and disappears when Carl arrives. 2 days later, Frank meets Brenda at the airport, but he notices she's receiving instructions through an earpiece. Frank escapes the FBI by posing as a pilot and fleeing the country with a group of flight attendants. 7 months later, Carl discovers that the fraudulent checks were made by a machine only found in France. Suspecting Frank is hiding in his mother's village, he heads to France to find him. Carl finds Frank in France, producing fraudulent checks. He convinces Frank to return with him to the United States, but Frank is arrested by French police and put in prison. Carl manages to bring him back to the U.S., but on the flight, he learns that Frank's father has died. Frank escapes from the plane and goes to see his mother,
Sir, we're going to let him get away.
who has remarried and has a new family. Frank is sentenced to 12 years in prison after surrendering to Carl, who is with the FBI. During his sentence, Carl visits Frank occasionally and shows him a fraudulent check that he suspects a bank teller is involved in. Impressed by Frank's knowledge, Carl convinces the FBI to let Frank serve the rest of his sentence working for them in the bank fraud unit. One day, Frank finds a pilot uniform in a tailor shop and reminisces about his past. With no family or friends to support him, he backslides into his old habits and tries to board a plane in the pilot uniform. In the end, Carl finds Frank and encourages him to stay, telling him he's not being chased anymore. Frank decides to stay and helps with the case, finally finding a place to belong. This true story ends with Frank Jr. being married for 26 years, residing in the Midwest with his 3 sons, and becoming a leading expert on bank fraud and forgery. He maintains a friendship with Carl Henry. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe.